OD is designed to improve organizational health and effectiveness and generally
Correct.
tackle organizational problems. But how? It's typically a mix between theoretical and
Right.
actual.
Right.
But it's never going to be effective if we do not ground ourselves towards the actual realities of an organization.
Hi everyone, Marie Apilocchio here of Radix HR. With me is part of the HR services team and actually the lead for OD, Organizational Development. We have here manager Mr. Rylle Zamora. Hi Rylle,
Hi, Marie.
are you ready for this conversation?
Of course. Always ready.
Absolutely. So I have always wanted to take this topic up for reasons that I want to enlighten our brethren in the HR community
Mhm.
about what OD is. You have breathed and lived this, you have studied it, and we have had a lot of projects that actually has used this as an intervention. So please tell us more what OD is all about.
Sure. So OD, let's start from the very beginning. It's an offshoot of HR when it was still called, I think, human relations.
Mm-hmm.
But now it's developed further to an interdisciplinary study.
Mm-hmm.
It incorporates a lot of concepts from behavioral sciences, namely sociology, psychology,
Correct.
industrial and organizational psychology,
Mm-hmm.
to improve overall effectiveness, health, and employee wellness. So that's the general overview
Correct.
of organizational development.
Correct. And it's one of the services that have actually, from a team perspective, business
Mhm.
perspective, it has been called upon for us to serve a number of customers here in the Philippines. Why do you think a number of companies don't have it in their HR arsenal?
Okay, so organizational development is not seen as a core human resource function. While it contributes a lot to organization success, and most of the well-established organizations and companies right now have an OD function, most starting and even those established do not have it as a core component because, of course, you have to first focus on the core HR functions. Typically, you have your recruitment, compensation, benefits, employee
Right.
life cycle, employee relations, and then you progress further. However, a short-term mindset contributes to the fact that it isn't as well established in different companies.
Mhm.
There's also a lack of general knowledge and expertise on how to execute it. Of course, if we're biased towards the core HR functions, most of the people in the HR field will gravitate towards those functions. So you will have a lack of practitioners that
Right.
actually specialize in this particular field. You know, there's less demand for it, then why should I specialize in it? I would rather play it safe.
Correct. So bang on. And which leads me to the question, does it require any special education to actually be a certified OD practitioner here in the Philippines?
There are certainly certifications here in the Philippines. Like I mentioned, it's an interdisciplinary study. Having a background in those that contribute to it will certainly help. Being an actual HR practitioner, because knowing the actual and knowing what actually happens in the real world, in the actual setting, contributes a lot to the effectiveness of an OD practitioner.
Correct. In solving organizational
Organizational
issues,
yes.
right? And can you name some of the more commonly used OD interventions that we know of? Because the one that is truly common, a lot of people gravitate towards training and development to bridge the gap.
Okay.
Right? But it's not all about training and development.
Yeah.
So can you name some of the more commonly used OD interventions?
All right. So maybe before I answer that question,
Yes.
let's take a step back and understand how actually OD tackles different organizational issues.
Yes. Okay.
So,
Cool.
and this actually also bleeds into your question a while ago. OD is designed to improve organizational health and effectiveness and generally
Correct.
tackle organizational problems. But how? It's typically a mix between theoretical and
Right.
actual.
Right.
But it's never going to be effective if we do not ground ourselves towards the actual realities of an organization. So you have to
Correct.
take into consideration culture, society, the present state of the organization, how big it is, how many employees it has, all
Right.
of those small things, all of the moving parts that exist within the company.
Right.
So now, to answer your question, the interventions related to OD are typically spurs towards the different HR functions. Your HR might already be doing OD-related interventions
Right.
because they defined it to be needed by the company. And that's the general job of the organizational development function,
Right.
to identify and improve the effectiveness of the company. So let's say there's a mismatch between job design and roles of a particular function. Naturally, a part of your HR would perform a job analysis, and that forms part of OD-related interventions. So if we are to say what are the common OD-related interventions, it would just be me saying, listing off the common HR interventions, which would be job analysis, training, strategic planning,
ESAT.
employee satisfaction, engagement. But one, I guess if you really want to be an organizational development practitioner, one very important intervention that is typically not conducted would be an assessment, planned change, and an action research. Because the difference between implementing an intervention as opposed to the full organizational development model is you first have to identify the problem and use empirical data to support the intervention that you will be implementing.
Bang on. I think that's where I want to take this conversation.
Yeah.
That the interventions are, the life cycle of an employee, or the way an organization is designed in HR would actually already intersperse part of the solution. But where OD could be super helpful is when you do an actual diagnostic using empirical data to actually change the landscape of the organization. So to solve for whatever issues they're experiencing. I'm going to bring this to another level, which is, without saying the name of the customers, can you name some of the organizations you've touched to improve certain aspects of their business life? I want you to give an example to our audience of how you yourself have led certain conversations with key holders or key positions in the organizations of a client, where you actually help them navigate either savings or design changes or ratio rationalization.
Okay, like I said a while ago, the challenges that OD tackles are all of the challenges that an organization encounters. The key difference from an actual OD practitioner is that we assess it differently. So, for example, a client came to us with a massive attrition issue. So we first have to understand why this exists and design our interventions around that. In one particular instance, we identified that there is a mismatch between the expectation between the end user, the recruiter, and the training, the learning and development function. So we can design particular interventions to address for that. It's either front-loading the recruitment function, depending on the resources of the organization. They may fortify the recruitment process, accept that the attrition will be part of their regular operations. But that, of course, will have a huge cost, but requires less effort in their side and can only be really executed if they have a strong sourcing platform and if, of course, they have the reputation to support it. Next would be a lot more effort is to further fortify so this is backloading it, fortifying their learning and development function and making sure that the few that come into their recruitment are fully equipped and will stay long within the organization. And then finally, on the end user side, this would apply to both interventions, is understanding and mitigating the internal factors that cause the attrition and addressing for that. It requires a lot of nuance. It requires a lot of understanding in terms of the different factors that play a role and making sure that you identify what's controllable or not. Every intervention, every problem that you will be tackling will be a bit of a smaller action research where you perform a natural experiment. You're controlling for variables and making sure that all of the participants are aware of what their role is to make sure that you get success. And of course, we want to measure that success. We don't want to just implement an intervention and hope for the best.
Absolutely.
It's never going to be. So this feeds into your question a while ago. Sorry if I'm
I love that you're very granular about it.
So it feeds into what you mentioned a while ago, why a lot of organizations do not want to have an OD function or do not have an OD function because they don't see the effectiveness. When an HR, a relatively young HR function in its early stages of development, implements an intervention, rarely does it measure the impact over a long course of time. It's usually just in the immediate. You would see if it worked or if it didn't. You wouldn't really break down why it didn't work and when it should. So that's a difference. If you want to use really an organizational development model, you have to understand why it did not work, assess for success, because it's rarely a one-size-fits-all model. It will always be a tailor-fit model.
Absolutely. That I wanted our viewers to know, that it's never ever like a one-trick pony when you solve for a certain issue.
The key to effectiveness is a strong diagnostic model and a diagnostic stage. You have to have all of the information, have a strong methodology, have a strong background in understanding research. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why, one of the contributory factors as well, why it's not as strong, because research in general is a difficult skill and a lot of people are averse to it. But I personally think that it's not as daunting as people make it out to be. It's actually quite interesting and has a lot of practical applications, like in OD.
I think what you're doing right now is encouraging a lot of either students or those who want to actually embark into OD work,
Mm-hmm.
a snippet of learning and hope that they can actually do it.
Mm.
I sort of want to end this with a question of, if we talked about the more commonly used interventions,
Mm-hmm.
what have you seen or what do you know of interventions that are not commonly used but are actually available in the HR arsenal?
Great question. So this is more of the, actually in and of itself, an assessment and diagnosis is rarely used because it's cumbersome. It takes time. It
Right.
requires a lot of resources, and it requires the buy-in of all of management and
Right.
executive.
Right.
And, it's hard to convince top leadership that this is going to take X and X months and it's going to cost you upwards of $1 million.
Right.
The return on this is going to be in a year. So it's a huge, huge investment that it's hard to convince a lot of them. So it's rarely implemented. Another intervention that I would like to see more is that the general interventions that leverage on employee involvement.
Okay.
So we are not averse in using experts. We are not adverse in using data. We are not averse in using peers within the same industry. But rarely do you see organizations actually creating a dialogue within their
Love that.
organizational system.
Right.
So in most cases, and there's empirical data to support this, people who work within an organization know the landscape and know the dynamics well enough to make informed decisions, well enough to be part of the conversation. While they don't have the final say, it's still going to be management.
Right.
It should be important to organizations to consider the employee's place and their experience in doing the actual work before making industry or landscape changing decisions. So there's a lot of factors why organizations are averse to it. For one, we typically centralize our decision-making power to top leadership.
Usually, yes.
And there's a fear that creating this environment would lead to employees taking back the power from management. But that's rarely the case. In fact, it even creates an environment where the employees feel more involved in the decision-making process. Next is redesigning your organization. And there's a lot more, but these are
Yes,
the
but-
top ones that I won't
yes,
take
yes,
too long on this.
yes.
But
But I love
redesign-
that. This one is really, redesigning the organization that speaks
Yeah.
well more on how the business operates. It's something that we kind of enjoyed a
Yeah.
lot in the last few months that we've been working together in OD projects.
Yeah. Redesigning and restructuring an organization is common. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
A lot of organizations do it. A lot of our clients have approached us to do it.
Right.
But one thing I do not see is organizations exploring other forms that would fit well. We are always stuck with the traditional stance of creating functional groups, departmental groups.
Always.
That is pretty straightforward, but in some cases, especially right now where we have a lot of technology we could leverage on, the strength of how information flows between and the swiftness of how information is shared can be leveraged. And rarely do we ever explore other forms of organizational design. Self-directed teams is one. Process-oriented functions is one. So normally you would be segregated by functions, but in
Right.
process, you would just respect the process.
Right.
But self-directed teams would be creating teams that are solely, their goals are defined by them. They do not have a formal role within the org. They create one from themselves. And a lot of, typically within the tech and the IT world, you would see a lot of these, but it does not expand outside of that. There are companies right now where the maximum amount of levels within their company are 3, and it's just the leader, the rank and file, and sometimes a senior leader, and that's enough. And then some companies would only form teams as needed. They do not have a direct manager all the time. So I'm not saying to lift and shift what works for a very, very cool and
Right,
successful company. Again, the point of OD is to identify what works for you and tailor fit it to what you have.
Absolutely. And honestly, we can go on and on talking about it. It's really exciting. It's one of the things that in the HR community or the HR world, this kind of conversations make you kilig, if I can use that word, because it's the technical stuff in it that, makes you really want to go deep and wide, and, it can really help the organizations. But that said, that's all the time we have at this point, Ryle. And thank you for allowing me to ask you as much questions as we can. I hope our audience learned a lot from this particular episode. And if we need a second one, we would actually encourage our audience to actually tell us more. What area in OD would you like us to embark on? All right. Thank you, Ryle.
Thanks, Marie.